Vice President Kamala Harris encouraged Americans to do their own work in solving the debt ceiling fight yesterday. Quote, talk with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, and make sure they understand the real consequences a default would have on their lives. Let's organize, activate our communities, and remind folks of what's at stake. This came just after the vice president dropped off of a Zoom call with reporters about the consequences of a default. According to the Washington Post's Jeff Stein, an administration official cited technical difficulties.
Fox News' Jesse Waters criticized the vice president in a segment this week. Let's watch that.
Look, I just think that Vice President Harris hasn't gotten the credit she deserves. She was an attorney general of the state of California. She has been a United States senator. She is really very, very good. And with everything going on, she hasn't gotten the attention she deserves.
Critics would say you're elevating her because they think you wouldn't serve a full term.
So how do you elevate the vice president? Major policy address, foreign trip, 60 Minutes interview? No. Kamala's doing a podcast from some lady's garage.
First question, let's start with your favorite song of all time.
Oh, my favorite song of all time. I was going to say something from Bootsy, but
we love that.
I mean, I don't know if your viewers know Funkadelic.
Yeah.
Okay. Bob
Okay.
Marley for sure.
Okay.
There's a range. I have a range, but I'm a hip hop kid. That's
Okay.
how I grew up.
Drums or flats?
Drums.
Okay.
Hot.
Oh, any
Yes.
special sauce?
No, that's just it.
Okay.
Just good and plain that way.
That was cringe. Whenever Kamala is asked, like, name a song, she said, I like Bob Marley, maybe something from Bootsy. I'm a hip hop kid. They said, name a song, and she cannot name a song. But Biden also couldn't point to anything in her record recently since taking office as vice president as to why she should get credit for doing a good job as vice president. He said, she was attorney general in California. She served in the U.S. Senate. What has she done since becoming the vice president? It's not that hard.
Well, and that's the sad thing, is that she doesn't have any accomplishments, right? I mean, she was put in charge of the border. It took her months to actually go down there. She failed to negotiate a real deal with the Mexican president to enforce border security. She basically blamed the whole thing on root causes over and over again without really explaining what they were besides climate change. And then she cracked that really ill-timed joke about how she had never been to Europe either. Then she was put in charge of helping pass the voting rights federal legislation, which obviously didn't get through. I think she was put in charge of another piece of legislation recently that didn't work out either. So it's just a string of failures for her, unfortunately. And maybe if she had some kind of redeeming personality, she could turn the ship around and be something of a successful politician, at least as a likable sidekick to Joe Biden. But she's failed to even do that.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that technical difficulties were really to blame when she left a Zoom call about the potential default on the U.S. debt. Of course, we know it's not necessary for the U.S. to ever default on their debt. It's a choice if the U.S. decides to default. And it's one that a lot of people, it seems, are considering by saying, it's never going to happen unless you do X, Y, and Z thing that I want you to do. Let's cut here, here, and here. Let's relitigate all of the things that we already agreed in a prior Congress to spend money on. It's ridiculous. But instead of making some kind of substantive argument for a path forward as the vice president of what maybe she believes should be done, because I can understand the criticism, well, she's not in a position of power here, it's not really in her hands, but you're a leader. Say what you would like for people to do. Senator Markey was interviewed, Ed Markey out of Massachusetts, where he said a default is not necessary. Do whatever you have to do. We can mint $1 trillion coin. He's citing real legal policy options for what the path forward could be. Why isn't the vice president doing that? And I think that's folks' main concern with her, is not just that there are things outside of her power. She hasn't been given power, but she's not being a leader. And I think that's a fair criticism.
Definitely. I mean, it's her job as the vice president to encourage and boost administration policy as set by Joe Biden. And if she can't get on a Zoom call, which is one of the easiest ways to go on television, by the way, and and iterate the administration's policy, then that is just a fundamental failure of her responsibility. And this is not the first time that she's supposedly had technical difficulties when on a Zoom call. I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago, she was on an interview with Charlemagne the God, and he asked her who the real president was, Joe Biden or Joe Manchin, because at that time they were debating the infrastructure package. And Kamala pretended that she couldn't hear the question, and then Simone Sanders, her press secretary at the time, jumped on and said that they had to end the interview. So this is some kind of tactic that she uses to get out of difficult questions, I guess, but it would be a lot easier if she just did her prep work before she went into interviews. There was reporting back in Politico that said Kamala infamously didn't read the briefings that people put together for her. She would blame staff members for failures, even though she hadn't done the prep work. And it kind of just sounds like she thinks she can float through life being successful or failing upwards without putting in any of the work.
Yeah. Kamala leaving that Zoom interview abruptly is giving like the Chappelle Show skit. Where he just knocks over the water and just leaves out of the meeting. But that's actually been a pretty standard practice for the Biden administration, to just leave press conferences without addressing the most important questions of the day. And I get that Joe Biden is an Irish Catholic man, right? He's pretty good at the Irish goodbye when it comes to press conferences. And it looks like Kamala Harris is adopting the Irish goodbye strategy. It's not a terrible strategy. I think it's how we got out of Afghanistan. Joe Biden just said, we're going to Irish goodbye, walk out of there without leaving. It's a problem that they keep doing this in press conferences as well. When we're talking about things of consequence, it feels like there's just a void of leadership across the board when you can't speak to the public about what's going on. I mean, they said we're having meetings with legal scholars about all of our options if we are forcing a default. But then you have Janet Yellen saying we're going to have to make some priorities about what we actually fund, which is unconstitutional for the Treasury to do. They cannot make budgetary decisions. That is the role of Congress. They can't say we're going to make good on our obligations when it comes to Treasuries, but cut Social Security. It's simply not up to them. And we need leadership from people in the highest public office in the United States right now, because there are folks who genuinely believe the United States is about to run out of money and everything's going to collapse, which is just not an accurate framing of what's going on. So even be descriptive about what's happening if you're not going to put a path forward. They can't even do that.
No, and it just seems like the Biden administration wants to pass the buck on to somebody else, because when Kamala did have that moment where she talked about assuring Americans that things were going to be okay, she basically told them that it was their responsibility to activate each other and organize to help prevent the default. It's not Americans' jobs to tell you to do your job. It's your job to do your job, right? Like, it's really simple. You get in there, you negotiate, you work out a deal with Republicans, and you find something that everybody can be slightly less unhappy about, and you put it through the House and the Senate, and then Joe Biden signs it. Like, it shouldn't be that difficult. To tell Americans that they're supposed to, I don't know, I guess call their congressman and senator and say, hey, I'd really like to not default today. Give me a break.
Yeah, I really wish somebody would do something about this. You're the vice president of the United States. I mean, give the people a plan. What do we call and ask for? What would you like the course of action to be? That's really what the void of leadership is. And you have so many people who just love Democrats. They love the Democratic Party, and they're perfectly happy saying, well, that's not her job. She doesn't have the power to do that. It's like, so she's asking us, we have the power to do that? We certainly do not. They have the power to introduce, legislation and really get a lot of people's attention to the legislation that they introduce, more than I do, more than you do, Amber. And it's a cop-out, really. They're perfectly okay with having the debt limit continuing to be a bargaining chip in a game of chicken so that we can relitigate prior Congress's spending authority. They really like the austerity that we have in the United States at the end of the day, that the debt limit is a huge part of maintaining as status quo when it comes to our policies and public programs.
Well, I'll tell you what, Jessica, with all of this piling on of the vice president this segment, I hope that the K-Hive doesn't come after us, because they can be pretty brutal.
Yeah, they can be very brutal. I'm not afraid of them after the Bernie campaign, though, Amber.
Oh, that's good. You have a thick skin then. We'll be back with more Rising after this.